Thank you very much. Before I do, let me just acknowledge the terrific job you did as moderator for the past 2 days. Your stamina, your questions, first rate.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
The title of the conference is No Security Without Values, and I think that is spot on. I'm not going to stand up here and try to summarize yesterday's and today's discussions. That would be a very foolish thing to do. But let me just say that what we saw unfold November 2013 through February last year, the Maidan, was very much a representation of values. It was about dignity. It was about rule of law, an end to corruption. It was about fairness. It was about orientation with the Euro-Atlantic community. It very much was about values. So too, almost a decade before, was the Maidan movement in November 2004, which was about an effort to steal an election, and protesters who said they would not stand for that. So I think we have to acknowledge that Ukrainians for the past decade have demonstrated an unbelievable and admirable commitment to values that the West stands for. And I think we have to give enormous credit to the Ukrainians for that. They have made the ultimate sacrifice in many cases, not only in Kyiv and Maidan, but on the front lines fighting Russian forces. And so we have an obligation to uphold these values, to support Ukraine's efforts and its aspirations to associate with, integrate more closely into Euro-Atlantic institutions. But there are, to me, 4 main threats to this pursuit that Ukraine is on. 2 are internal and 2 are external. Let me start with the internal. The first is lack of unity, infighting. Putin, paradoxically, did more to unite this country than anybody else. It would be a shame and a crime even, a mistake as has been famously said, if suddenly the unity that has been brought about was unraveled. If we return to the infighting that we saw cripple this country a decade ago. The government, the president, everyone, the cabinet have to work together. This country is still in crisis. A year ago when we had this forum, the tension was palpable. Things seem to have calmed down a bit, but it is far from over, as Ukrainians in this room know much better than I do. This is arguably the best government in the country's history since 1991. It has to focus on the tasks at hand. Getting the economy right, fixing the financial situation, dealing with the problem of corruption, and of course, regaining full control over the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country. If the government collapses, if there's a big fight, then this country is going to have huge problems, and the West is going to lose interest. The reaction in the West, I guarantee you, will be, there they go again. Don't let it happen. Second threat, internal threat, corruption. Corruption's been a cancer for Ukraine for years. This is the biggest vulnerability that this country has. We have the new Anti-Corruption Bureau. It needs to be empowered. It needs to have the authority. It needs to act also very transparently. If there's going to be a move toward de-oligarchization, it has to be done the right way, but it also has to apply across the board. There can't be exemptions to dealing with corruption. Everyone has to be treated fairly according to rule of law. Has to be leadership from the top, and coming to power through elections has to mean serving the public good, the greater good. We have to end this notion, not just in Ukraine, but throughout the region, that when you come to power, it's your turn. It's your turn to enrich yourself. It's your turn to support your friends. Third threat, moving to the external, the obvious, Putin's Russia. A successful Ukraine that is moving toward deeper integration with Euro-Atlantic institutions is seen by Putin as a major existential threat. It could represent the alternative for what he is trying to prevent develop in Russia. The Maidan movement leading to Yanukovych's departure terrified Putin. In my view, it's why he moved into Crimea and then moved into eastern Ukraine. To him, it wasn't a popular movement. Ukrainians couldn't possibly have gone onto the streets themselves and demanded change. They had to have been paid and put out there by the West, including the State Department, which is, of course, utter nonsense, as it was a decade ago when Ukrainians went out on the streets. So we responded by invading and annexing territory. This is Putin's war against Ukraine, against the Maidan, against democracy, against the West, against our values. We need to be crystal clear. The Putin regime is a threat. It's a threat to its own people, most recently with the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, and possibly tragically a poisoning of Vladimir Kara-Murza just this week. It's a threat to its neighbors. You know this better than I do. Georgians know it. Estonians knew it in 2007 with a cyber attack. It's a threat to the West by trying to redraw the borders in Europe for the first time since World War II. It's a threat more globally when we look at Putin's support for Bashar al-Assad's slaughter of the Syrian people through his decision to deliver S-300 missiles to Iran. The Putin regime is a rotten, kleptocratic, authoritarian regime that is a threat, and we have to be crystal clear about that. The number one goal of Mr. Putin is staying in power. The number two goal of Mr. Putin is staying in power, and the number three goal is refer to goals 1 and 2. Staying in power is what he thinks about every single day. And he will do whatever is necessary in order to accomplish those three goals. So we need to view Russia as a threat, not as a potential strategic partner, which is not to say that we can never talk to it. We have to. Let's be realistic about it. Though I would argue we don't have to schlep all the way to Sochi and be grateful that Mr. Putin spent 4 hours with you. We should not have any illusions that Putin's Russia can be a partner of Ukraine or of the West. This means tougher sanctions, not just keeping the current sanctions in place. And unfortunately, I think in the current debate that is taking place, Mr. Putin has won this battle. Because the discussion is not about ramping up sanctions. The hope is that we can keep the sanctions that are already in place. And that, unfortunately, sends the wrong psychological message to Moscow, thinking that we're struggling just to keep up what we've already been doing. It means being clear about our goals. Unity with the EU is not a goal. It is a tactic. It is a means to accomplish our goals, which should be getting Russia out of Ukraine and helping Ukraine succeed. I don't know of a single person who is opposed to US-EU unity. But it also can't become an excuse for the United States not to take a leadership position. We all too often hide behind US-EU unity to settle for the lowest common denominator when there will be times where it's easier for one government, my government, the US government, to take steps that maybe 28 governments can't agree on. If Putin is not stopped in Ukraine, the threat will only get worse. And we will wake up, we NATO member states will wake up one day to discover we have a problem with a country that has Article 5 guarantees. Ukraine is key to fulfilling the vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And let's not forget that. The fourth and final goal, and it segues from where I finished the fourth and final threat, and it segues from where I was describing the Russia threat, is the West. A West that neglects Ukraine, that lacks resolve, that loses interest. And Ukraine can help bring this about if it doesn't get its act together. The West deserves credit for the sanctions that have been put in place. I've argued they've been too slow and too reactive, but let's keep in mind that what we have in place today is an enormous sea change from where we were a little over a year ago. The support for Ukraine also should be commended. But it isn't enough. It's not enough to help this country succeed, to defend itself militarily. The military aid that President Obama has not provided, I think, has been an enormous mistake. And as I think one of the panelists here had mentioned, it is the president. Everyone else in the cabinet, the entire U.S. Congress has supported this. But the president hasn't. And in our system, he does have the final say. And I respect that system. But fortunately, in my system, I'm almost also able to criticize my president. And I think he's made a serious mistake. There's no subcontracting to Europe for this problem. This requires U.S. presidential leadership on a sustained basis while recognizing, as Steve Pfeiffer rightly pointed out yesterday, the many challenges on President Obama's plate. Absolutely. But the subcontracting, I would argue, and I don't criticize Chancellor Merkel for what she's done. She's tried to fill a void. The subcontracting has not worked terribly well. The U.S. needs to be more engaged at the highest levels. It means keeping the doors open to the EU and NATO, and I very much appreciate the discussion up here. But to me, it would be an enormous mistake for either the EU or NATO to close the doors, because that would be telegraphing to Putin what we won't do. Let's see if Ukraine can meet the criteria one day. Let's keep the door open. The prospect of membership has been so important to countries in this region to undertake difficult necessary reform that they saw a recognition of those difficult steps at the end of the process. Let's reject Finlandization, because it again puts a limit on Ukraine's aspirations, with decisions being made above them rather than with them. It means stop blaming us. I reject the argument that the EU's Eastern Partnership in 2013 is responsible for this crisis. But even if you want to say that the EU mishandled that, that is absolutely no justification whatsoever for Russia to invade Ukraine. That is not the way to handle disputes. NATO enlargement, let's also be clear. Russia may not like it, but NATO enlargement has provided the most secure, stable borders that Russia has. The countries where Russia does not neighbor NATO are the most dangerous borders that it has. It also means cleaning up our own systems. I talked about fighting corruption here in Ukraine, a huge challenge. We have a challenge ourselves in the West to clean up our own systems so that ill-gotten gains by Russian oligarchs and officials can't safely plant themselves in our real estate, in our banking systems, so that they can't enjoy vacationing on our beaches or elsewhere. It means not telegraphing our limitations to Putin. We should stop saying what we won't do and leave Putin wondering what we might do. It's called strategic ambiguity. Leave him guessing. It means thinking about the short term and the long term. We will never get to the long term if we don't get the short term right. It means staying true to our values, our principles, and those include sovereignty, territorial integrity, democratic institutions, rule of law, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, all the things that sometimes we in the West take for granted that Ukrainians have been fighting for since November 2013 and even before. It's why this conference and the title of this conference are so important. So let me just say I'm grateful to the organizers for bringing us all here today. I have to say, if this conference were being held in Washington on a Friday afternoon, this hall would be half full. I'm deeply impressed by the attendance here today. And I want to turn it over now to the person we're very grateful to, Teresa Yatsenyuk. Thank you.